So unlike some of the previous panels, and it's always been a bit of a mix, whether the speaker is presenting a solution and the panelists are responding to the proposed solution, in this case it's definitely not the case. I'm going to propose a problem, and the panelists, each of which in their own efforts are addressing one of the many strands of solutions to that problem. Now, I need to outline a problem because we have a very serious problem that is as yet under-recognized on the international agenda. And so I want to talk about the rebirth of modern education. And the difficulty with talking about this is that everyone agrees on the expansion of schooling. So this is probably the movement for more schooling is probably the single most successful movement in the history of the 20th century, if not in the history of man, because not only has it actually been successful at getting kids in school, it's swept the ideological spectrum. So if you're the most corrupt and autocratic country on earth, you do education. If you're the UN, World Bank, and you want to build your bona fides as a development organization, you commit to a goal in education. If you're a college kid who wants to save the world, you go to education. If you're a heartless corporate raider who has plundered the treasury and now wants to create a foundation to give back to the world, you set up a foundation for education. Everyone agrees that development will be promoted by the expansion of education, but when Ricardo says I'm original thinker, nearly all of my presentations have a slide like this. Everyone is wrong. That's everyone but me. And if you agree with what I say, everybody but me and you, because for two reasons. One, the agenda was important, but it's over. Meaning, everybody is in schooling, more or less, around the world. The butts in seats agenda of building buildings into which kids could go, it's over. Moreover, though, we have, in the interests of articulating a successful movement that could generate complete consensus about schooling, we lost sight that schooling had a purpose called education or learning. And now what we have is schools in which children are not learning. We have a system in which more of the same cannot and will not meet reasonable education goals. And so what we really need is a new movement for education that has been just as powerful as the movement has been for schooling. So let me show you the agenda for getting more kids in school has succeeded beyond our wildest imaginings. So kids in Haiti today have the labor force in Haiti has more years of schooling in 2010 than Germany did in 1975. Bangladesh has more schooling today than France had in 1975. This is a jaw-dropping thing because in 1975, France and Germany were well-developed, quite rich, quite prosperous, quite democratic, quite capable societies, thank you very much. And Haiti is none of those. So even in economies that are basket cases in every other dimension, butts have been gotten into seats. It's essentially over. But the education goals and schooling goals were supposed to have been connected by a learning profile. What do I mean by a learning profile? Well, our goal, anybody's legitimate goal all along, was really articulated in terms of education objectives. You know, we wanted kids to emerge from their formal training adequately equipped to be adults in the society they lived in. Economically productive, politically active, socially engaged adults. That was the goal of schooling, and that was an education goal. And however we describe it, and to put numbers to it, we're going to limit ourselves to certain things, but we had objectives in this. What we were doing was focusing on schooling goals. Is it not on? You just had to move. So these two are linked only if there's some relationship between schooling or an adequately steep relationship between the speed at which students would acquire skills by sitting through schools. Now, what we see is a pure schooling goal is a punishment, right? If you say, no, I really have a schooling goal, they should just sit there, and I don't care if they learn anything, That's a punishment, right? That's time served. But we really wanted to reach education goals. Now, the thing is that if there's a flat learning profile, then the pace at which children are acquiring schools means they're leaving, we're meeting the schooling goals of minimal, of primary, universal primary, or we could even meet goals of universal basic without getting anywhere near to actually adequately equipping children to be citizens of the 21st century. So more schooling just does not really push us that far in an education dimension. So let me give 3 different data sets, all from India. And I'm choosing India because I know India reasonably well. I choose India because this allows me to use Madhav's data. I choose India because it's a country of 1 billion people that everybody thinks is doing spectacularly well in education. And I choose India because it turns out it's actually pretty typical. So, what happens when you look at a learning profile? This is what a learning profile looks like, which is, let's just ask kids in grades 2, 3, 4, 5, simple questions, and see how much a year of schooling increases their proficiency at these simple questions. Of course, we want them to be able to use these skills in much more complex ways, but let's just start with, can they add a single-digit number, right? And what you find is, even by grade 2, about 35% can, and after 1, 2, 3 more years of schooling, only about 1 in 5 kids has acquired that skill. So they have now just spent 3 years of schooling, and only 1 in 5 can answer that simple question that couldn't answer it before those 3 years of schooling. That's a flat learning profile. If we look then, take these simple questions and take exams that have done 11 questions grade 2 to 5 and say, what's the likelihood if you come into a grade not being able to answer a question, you can answer that question after completing 1 more year of schooling? So again, we're norming on the kids that come in not able to read, not able to answer. And the answer across all 3 of these broadly representative, this is representative of a state, this is representative of the country more or less, is about 1 in 10. That's just stunning. So 9 out of 10 kids are sitting through an entire year of schooling without it adding to their ability to answer a simple question or to perform a simple capability like reading a story. That's shocking. Now, if we go to things like, and of course, this we're still measuring incredibly rote skills. And then, of course, we want, for the 21st century, we need an entirely higher order of skills. Well, let's go to a slightly more conceptual question. And this is what passes for a conceptual question, which is, how long is this pencil? Why is that a conceptual question? Well, because you have to recognize that even though they've taught you that this pencil is 4, it's really the difference between the starting point and the ending point. Whereas overwhelmingly, kids answer that the pencil's 6 centimeters long. And they do it in 4th grade, and they do it in 6th grade, and they do it in 8th grade. Even in 8th grade, more children still think that pencil is 6 centimeters long, because what have they learned? The length of an object is where it falls on the ruler. They haven't actually learned length. They haven't actually used measurement. And the group that did this exam did this dynamically. So they actually would do it live with a ruler and a pencil and move the pencil. And kids would respond that the pencil was getting longer. Which is funny, but it's sad. It's really the most tragic video I have ever seen, because these kids have bought into the notion that if they go to school, their lives will be transformed. What somebody forgot to mention was, if you go to school and learn the skills you will need, your life will be transformed. So I just want to do one illustration with this piece of modern art. I say it's modern art because then you, even though you have a negative reaction at first, you'll grow to love it and then want to buy a piece of it. What this is showing is the size of these is the distribution of kids in Ghana by whether or not they finish school. And this line is our best guess at the learning profile in Ghana, which is fixed at a point because they actually took a test in 8th grade. And we've just linearly interpolated. And by their current scores in 2003, let's say we established a sort of Millennium Learning Goal of 400, which is an unbelievably low level that no country in the world would want to be lower than. And then ask what fraction of kids of a recent cohort, so this is the completion of a recent cohort, this is a learning profile that shows how much children who have completed these levels of school know in terms of distributions from low to high. And so this area up here is how many of them are above a learning goal. And again, an unbelievably basic learning goal. Not a learning goal that, I mean, basically all of a European population would be above this goal, right? Okay, 5% are above the goal. Now let's say we push so that everybody in the cohort finishes grade 9. What that means is that no kids drop out, all kids go to school, all of the cohort are at least at grade 9, but if they were to finish at grade 9, how many of them would be above a learning goal? Well, we now have 10%. So even relative to a vast, unbelievably expensive and ambitious expansion of schooling, we have only gone from 5% of the kids being adequately prepared to 10% of the kids being adequately prepared because they just weren't learning enough per year of schooling. Now, obviously, and this just simulation shows, were we able to even raise the average score in Ghana to 400, which again, the average score of 15-year-olds on this same exam in the United States is 500. As someone who has been the parent of several American 15-year-olds, this is not like a super high standard, right? The average 15-year-old in the United States is probably desperately unprepared, and on this scale, they're at 500, right? So somebody at 400 would be in the bottom 10th percentile of a typical American classroom. But if we're managed to even get to 400, then at least, even with the same distribution of schooling, we've got 30% of the kids adequately above 400. Minimally adequately prepared, maybe. So the question then is, if we want to switch from a schooling goal to a learning goal, the only conceivable way we will achieve learning goals is by steepening the learning profile. Kids just have to learn more per time in school than what they're typically doing in the average developing country now. Then you might say, okay. Good with that agenda. You can buy into that. But then the question is, what does the steepening the learning profile look like? One goal, one characterization of the world, which empirical data should be able to tell us about, is that the world looks like this, that we kind of know the inputs. The inputs are what I call EMIS visible. I can create a management information system. I can push inputs out that management information system, and I will get to the change I need, which is about a standard deviation, a student's standard deviation in improvement in learning profile from just pushing inputs. But this is a characterization of what the world actually looks like. Well, we have a lot of evidence about what the world looks like. Or the world could look like this, which is mostly what we see is the deviations aren't related to these simple EMIS visible inputs, but rather is due to things that I'll call system changes, for want of a better word. Now, if the world looks like this, then even if we were to adopt the business as usual expansion of inputs, more training teachers, smaller class sizes, more learning inputs, we would end up with better scores, but still scores that would be vastly below the potential we could get from system changes. So what does the sort of old school evidence tell us? And I say old school, it's inside baseball, but what it tells us that if we're thinking of a student standard deviation as the gain we need, if you look at nearly any empirical study that's ever been done of the relationship between inputs and outputs, the most you can get out of outputs is about 1/10 of a standard deviation. It's just what the data say, is that these two things just aren't tightly linked, and since they're not tightly linked, you're pushing out a string. On the other hand, what the data say is there are lots of places in which we do get dramatic increases, either in learning or in the cost effectiveness of learning, and the question is how we discover, replicate, and scale those successes. So the difficulty that we're up against, and why I refer to a rebirth of modern education, is that there are kind of two fundamentally different ways to think about going about getting something done. And this is not my own analogy, but a couple of management consultants wrote a book about spiders and starfish. But the analogy is the spider has all the brains at the center. All the information from the system flows to the spider. The spider decides, do I go out and get the fly? All of the allocable information, all of the information flows to a center. All of the resources flow out. And the web is just muscle. It's just implementation. No thinking required anywhere but the center. A starfish, on the other hand, is this very practically ontologically weird organism because it has no brain. You know, it doesn't, when you see a starfish move, you might say the starfish decided to move. But that's not actually an accurate characterization. It moved because the tentacles on this side were moving towards something more than the tentacles on this side, and the overall organism was dragged by this part of it. There were no central signals that went and said, move right. It just moved right, responding to the pressures of what was going on in this side versus that side. So a starfish, now, the beauty of a starfish is that it's really kind of inefficient and slow and can do weird things. But if you cut a starfish into 30 bits, not 30 bits, but you cut a starfish into 5 bits, you got 5 starfish. Because there is no way to destroy it. Whereas a spider, as we've all learned, once the spider's dead, the web's useless. So if you have centralized power, authority, control, and thinking, then if that power, authority, and control and thinking fails, it fails completely. So why do I say the why do I say the rebirth of modern education? Because our educational systems in the West all arose out of starfish systems. In nearly every rich country, most of the population was in school before there was ever a schooling system. It arose because of the demands for parents for their children to be prepared as to be adults, and they organized themselves to give them education. Matter of fact, every society has had universal education. After all, education is preparing your children to be adults. What society did not? But that actually went into, given the rise of industrialization, the rise of bureaucracy, and secular nationalism as these three forces, into super consolidated spider systems that are today's modern schooling systems. They consolidated from starfish into spiders, building off the success and organic development of the starfish into controlled spiders. Now, this has led to, well, this is wrong, to what we now have is in most rich countries, we have functional spiders. We have schooling systems that work well enough, right? If you look at the test results out of, it's a lot of heat about not a whole lot of difference. So, there's a lot of debate about whether France or Germany or Canada or US has a better schooling system, but in fact the differences are sort of between 520 and 516 and 506. Now that said, these guys are all functional, all stagnant. They're functional but stagnant. They got almost no innovation going on them, in that the US is at exactly the same level of learning in the mid-2000s at least as it was in 1975. A fact which, as a 52-year-old with children, both shocks me and thrills me, because I know my kids aren't smarter than I am because the tests prove it, all right? Second, I'm really disappointed that in a world that has progressed in revolutionary ways in nearly every dimension of life in the last 30 years, our output of our functional spider schooling systems in the rich world looks almost exactly the same as it looked when I was a child, and can't be happy about that. Now, what the second thing that happened, though, is that these modern school systems, after the consolidation, got transplanted to developing countries. This transplantation process produced two very different outcomes. There's a small set of states that bought into the spider, had high state capability, had high social cohesion, and had high stakes for the student exams, and they have very high performance. So Korea, Singapore, all of these countries that have high performance have exactly these three characteristics. In most of the rest of the world, we transplanted a modern school system torn from its starfish roots into a situation of weak state capability, and we've got dead spiders. We have spiders who are built on the premise that all the thinking is at the center and only muscle is at the periphery, with no thinking at the center. So this is how you get country after country after country meeting schooling goals but not meeting learning goals, because we no longer have a functional driving force at the center actually driving towards legitimate goals for student learning. Rather, they're driving themselves on isomorphic mimicry, which is they continue to look like a spider without any of the bite. So this leaves us with two very distinct challenges. One challenge is for most of the richer part of the world, which is we're at 500 on these scales, but we're at a level, and we're at a level that we're stuck at and have been stuck at for about 35 years. That's how long we have the data anyway. When we know that the 21st century skills are vastly changing. So we've got a functional but stagnant system that's increasingly out of touch with the economic needs at the top. And at the bottom, it's worse than that. We have dysfunctional systems that aren't even delivering minimal learning in the basics, much less any capability to deliver the new basics. So in the rich world, we have one problem of a stagnant spider who is managing to resist innovation and change, even though the potential seems to exist for it. But in the poor world, we actually have dysfunctional spiders in which no amount of additional expansion of schooling per se will lead children to actually be ready for the 21st century, because they're just not learning inside these organizations called schools. And how to go about reforming a dysfunctional, or how to make a dysfunctional system into a functional one, is an enormous sort of challenge.